The word father is supposed to mean protector, guide, the one who shields you from the horrors of the world. But what happens when the danger doesn't come from outside the home? What if it's sitting across the dinner table, smiling, pretending to love you, while secretly hiding unthinkable darkness? History is filled with criminals, killers, and tyrants, but some of the most terrifying figures were not strangers at all. They were fathers, men who were meant to nurture but instead destroyed. Men who use their authority not to protect, but to control, not to love, but to terrify. These are the stories that force us to ask the hardest question of all. How can a man who gives life take it away with such cruelty? Tonight, we step into the chilling world of the most evil fathers in history. Stories where the word Hadad no longer meant safety, it meant fear. Imagine being a child, hearing footsteps in the hallway, not knowing if those steps mean comfort or torment. Imagine growing up never sure if the man standing in your doorway is there to kiss you goodnight or to destroy everything you love. This is not fiction. These are not ghost stories whispered around a campfire. These are real lives, real victims, real fathers who crossed the line from love into pure evil. Some fathers became tyrants inside their own homes, ruling with fists, rage, and manipulation. Others orchestrated crimes so unspeakable, the world struggled to believe a father could commit them. Some wore masks of charm in public while unleashing hell on their families in private. And some became infamous monsters whose names are etched into the darkest pages of history. But the truth is chilling. Evil fathers do not always look like monsters. They don't always shout. They don't always strike in anger. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they pretend. And sometimes they destroy with quiet calculation, step by step, until their families are trapped in a nightmare they can't escape. Tonight, you'll hear about fathers who shattered the very meaning of parenthood, men who turned their homes into prisons, men who left behind scars that time could never erase, and men who remind us that evil doesn't always come from strangers in the shadows. It can live under your own roof. These are stories of betrayal, of cruelty, of unimaginable darkness. But they are also warnings. Because the scariest monsters are not the ones hiding in the woods. They are the ones who smile at you across the table, the ones who know your name, the ones who should have loved you most. So ask yourself this: what would you do if the man you trusted to protect you became the man you feared most? Also, what would you do if love turned into terror? Stay with me. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at the word father the same way again. At first glance, he seemed ordinary. A man who blended into the background, living the kind of life no one would ever question. He worked. He smiled at neighbors. He waved at strangers passing by. To the outside world, he was just another father, someone who provided, someone who belonged. But behind the front door of his home, another story was unfolding. A story hidden from curious eyes. A story no one wanted to believe could be true. Why? The children who lived in that house didn't see him the way the world did. To them, he wasn't just a father, he was a storm. Sometimes calm, sometimes silent, and sometimes violent enough to leave everyone trembling. They learned to read his moods in the smallest of gestures: a slammed cupboard, a certain tone in his voice, even the way his footsteps echoed down the hall. Every sound carried a warning. The home should have been a place of comfort. A place where birthdays were celebrated, where laughter filled the rooms, where bedtime meant safety. But in this family, bedtime was often the hour of fear. Silence became survival. Smiles became masks. And love, real love, was replaced by something cold, unpredictable, and dangerous. On the surface, he played the role of a father well. At church, at school events, at family gatherings, he knew how to act. He shook hands, he told stories, he carried himself like any other proud dad. People admired his discipline. They mistook his strictness for strength, but they never saw what happened when the curtains were closed. His children were too young to understand what was happening, too young to realize that what they were enduring wasn't normal. They thought every child lived with fear. Every child walked on eggshells. Every child kept secrets. They believed that love and pain were supposed to be tangled together. The mother, too, was caught in the cycle. At first, she believed in him, believed in the promises, the charm, the apologies that always came after the outbursts. But over time, she began to see the truth. His kindness was a mask. His control was absolute. And little by little, the walls of that home began to feel less like shelter and more like a prison. What makes this story even more haunting is how normal it all looked from the outside. Friends who visited saw nothing. Relatives who stopped by sensed little more than tension. He made sure of that. Every smile he wore in public was calculated, every gesture rehearsed. He knew how to play the role of a good father, and he played it perfectly. But the cracks were there, small, subtle, easy to overlook. A child too quiet at school, a bruise explained away with a clumsy excuse. A wife who seemed distant, always tired, always nervous. These signs whispered of something darker, but no one listened closely enough. The truth was far more sinister than anyone dared imagine. Because this was not just a strict father. This was not just a man with a temper. This was a man hiding a darkness that would soon come crashing into the light. And that is where the story turns. A family living in quiet terror. A father whose love was poisoned by control, rage, and something much darker. Victims who couldn't escape. And a community that would one day look back and ask the question, how did we not see it sooner? This is where the nightmare begins. The warning signs were always there, small at first, easy to dismiss, easy to excuse, but in hindsight, every moment pointed towards something far more sinister. It began with the way he controlled the smallest details, what his family wore, how they spoke, when they were allowed to laugh. At first, it seemed like strict parenting, the kind that neighbors praised as a discipline. But inside the home, it didn't feel like discipline. It felt like surveillance. Every word, every gesture, every mistake was noticed. Nothing escaped him. His anger came quickly and without warning. A misplaced toy, a dish left unwashed, a question asked at the wrong time. The punishment never matched the crime. He would raise his voice, slam doors, and remind everyone in the house that he was in charge. The children learned to fear his silence even more than his shouting, because silence meant something was coming. There were moments when his mask slipped in public, just for a second. A too firm grip on his child's shoulder, a harsh word spoken through clenched teeth, a glare that froze the room. Most people brushed it off. He's just a strict father, they said. He doesn't mean any harm. But those closest to him knew the truth. The harm had already begun. Control turned into isolation. Friends who once came around were quietly discouraged. Phone calls went unanswered. Invitations to birthday parties or sleepovers were denied with excuses. The children's world grew smaller, their lives confined to the shadow of their father's authority. And then came the lies. He became skilled at twisting reality, convincing his family that they were the problem, not him. If he lost his temper, it was because they provoked him. If they cried, it was because they were too sensitive. He told them they were lucky to have him, that no one else would tolerate them. Over time, those words took root, shaping their thoughts, weakening their confidence, making escape feel impossible. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes. The children stopped making eye contact. They rarely played outside. Their laughter, once carefree, became cautious, careful, almost rehearsed. At school, teachers saw signs too. A child who always seemed tired. Another who flinched when someone raised their voice. A drawing that hinted at fear. But again, no one wanted to believe the unthinkable. The mother, trapped in the same cycle, saw the red flags more clearly than anyone. She noticed how his temper flared faster, how the punishments grew harsher, how the moments of calm never lasted. But then she felt powerless. He had stripped away her confidence, her support, her ability to fight back. All she could do was try to shield the children, to soften the blows, to keep the peace for as long as possible. As time went on, the incidents escalated. What began as raised voices turned into slammed fists on the table. What began as stern warnings turned into threats whispered late at night. What began as subtle bruises explained away as accidents started to raise quiet questions. Each red flag was a signal, a flare in the dark, a warning of what was to come. But still, no one intervened. No one stopped him. And he knew it. With every unchecked outburst, his confidence grew. He learned he could hurt without consequence. He learned he could control without resistance. And slowly, the line between discipline and abuse, between father and tyrant, disappeared completely. The children lived in constant anticipation, never sure what version of their father would walk through the door. Would it be the man with the calm voice promising to be better? Or would it be the man with the clenched fists ready to unleash another storm? The signs were there. The warnings were clear, and yet no one stopped him. But this was only the beginning. It began with an ordinary night and a single small decision. He drank more than usual. The words came out sharper. A joke twisted into an insult. The air shifted. Everyone tensed. The first escalation was trivial. A phone call ignored, a dinner uneaten. He noticed. He punished. Voices rose. Doors slammed. Tiny punishments set the pattern. Each one taught a lesson. He controlled everything. Then came new rules. No friends after school. No outings without permission. Clothes chosen for them. Curfews moved earlier. At first it looked like structure. But structure hardened into chains. The family's freedom narrowed inch by inch. Arguments began to stack. What once could be solved with a calm conversation now exploded. A spilled glass became an accusation. A missed homework assignment became proof of disrespect. His tolerance thinned. His threats grew louder. He told them he would not be ignored. At night, whispers started. They spoke in corners. The children learned the sound of his footsteps and measured their breaths against it. The mother learned to breathe silently. Survival was an exercise in timing. He began to test limits. A door slammed harder. A warning clipped. A bruise blamed on a fall. He apologized later. Gifts arrived after the storm. Apologies were staged. So they became the promise that whatever happened would never be repeated. Until it was. Escalation is sneaky. It hides in repeated cruelties. A slap in the kitchen. A shove in the hallway. A push that ends with a child on a hardwood floor. Each incident normalized the next. Each panic settled into an uneasy calm. The family adapted. They learned to minimize. Outside, his mask remained flawless. He volunteered at school. He led prayers. He posed for photos. Those images made it harder to believe what was happening behind closed doors. He used his reputation like armor. Inside, control turned calculated. He watched the children like a hawk. He kept lists of their mistakes. He insisted they earn forgiveness. Rules multiplied. Punishments deepened. Fear became routine. He kept a small notebook. Dates circled. Incidents cataloged. He measured failures like a ledger. Planning replaced chance. He mapped the household's breaks. He waited for the perfect moment, an argument in the yard, a secret found in a drawer, a whispered plea that slipped past a lip. H became a fault line he could exploit. He rehearsed the story he would tell. He tested which threats would silence them. The family tried to push back. A child hid a note. A mother called a sister and hung up. A neighbor noticed a quieter child at the school gate. Brave. Risky. For every attempt at reaching out, he tightened the screws. The week before the breaking point was merciless. He stayed awake. He watched. Paranoia clouded his eyes. He sharpened his words into weapons. Threats became promises. He spoke of shame and consequences. The children slept with the lights on. Then the incident. A confrontation that began with a small provocation and spiraled. A lamp knocked over. A door left unlocked. A phone hidden in a sock. He accused. He moved closer. Temper met resistance. Voices pushed until the sound was raw and jagged. Someone shouted a name. Someone else screamed. The last night before the crime was different. There was a hush that felt like a held breath. The house smelled of cold coffee and bleach. Outside, a storm built. Inside, someone packed a bag. Someone rehearsed an excuse. He walked the rooms like a man measuring where he could strike without breaking everything. Then the moment arrived. It was swift. It was precise. It had been waiting, sharpened by months of small cruelties and growing confidence. What had been a pattern turned into a plan? What had been fear turned into action? One choice unfurled the rest. But even then, they could not have known the scale of what was coming. Not yet. No one was prepared for the aftermath. The night it happened felt like any other. The street outside was quiet. Neighbors were winding down, televisions glowing behind closed curtains. But inside that house, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The family already knew. The smallest sound, the smallest mistake could spark the storm. It began with an argument. Simple, harmless, a minor defiance. A child refusing to stay silent. A mother daring to speak too firmly. For most families, it would have ended with raised voices and slammed doors. But here, it was the spark that lit everything. He snapped. The calm mask he wore in public fell away completely. His voice turned into a roar that shook the walls. His eyes, once familiar, burned with something unrecognizable. This wasn't anger. It was something darker, something final. He moved through the house like a force of nature. Every word, every command delivered with a rage that could not be contained. The children cried. The mother begged. But he wasn't listening. He had crossed a line where reason no longer mattered. Objects flew. Furniture crashed. What had once been a home now felt like a battlefield. Each room bore witness as fear turned into chaos. The children tried to hide. The mother tried to shield them, but there was no escape. He controlled every corner, every door, every breath. The neighbors later said they heard nothing unusual. Maybe a raised voice, maybe a bang. But no one called for help. No one realized that behind those closed curtains, a nightmare was unfolding in real time. The cruelty was not rushed. It was deliberate, calculated. He wanted them to feel powerless. He wanted them to know there was no safety, no escape, no rescue coming. Step by step, he stripped away their defenses until all that was left was terror. And then the silence. The house grew eerily still. No more shouts, no more screams. Just silence, heavy and suffocating. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped, as if the very walls were holding their breath. What followed was even more chilling than the violence itself. He cleaned, he arranged, he rehearsed the story he would tell. To the outside world, this had to look like anything but what it truly was. He staged normalcy with a twisted precision, covering the horror with a thin, fragile mask of order. When morning came, the crime revealed itself in fragments. A phone left unanswered, a child absent from school, a door that remained shut long after it should have opened. People grew uneasy. Whispers began. Something was wrong, and then the discovery. What investigators found inside that home was worse than anyone could have imagined. They described the scene as haunting. A place once filled with life now frozen in devastation. The details were carefully recorded in police reports, but even those who wrote them admitted words could not capture the weight of it. Neighbors who once waved at him across the street stood in shock. Family friends refused to believe it. "I'm not him," they said. "I'm not this father." But the evidence left no room for doubt. The man they thought they knew had destroyed everything he was meant to protect. The crime was not just an act of violence, it was betrayal in its purest form. A father, the very symbol of protection, had become the source of unimaginable fear. The children he was meant to guide, the partner he was meant to cherish, all of them victims of the man who should have been their greatest offender. For investigators, the question was not only how it happened, but why? How could someone so ordinary, so trusted, turn into something so monstrous? Oh, what broke inside him? Or had that darkness been there all along, waiting for its moment? The truth was undeniable. The family had lived in fear. The red flags had been there for years. And now the nightmare everyone had ignored had reached its horrifying conclusion. The man who had once been called a father was now something else entirely. But as shocking as the crime was, the story did not end there. The morning after the crime, the house stood unnervingly quiet, curtains drawn, no movement, no signs of life. What had once blended into the neighborhood now radiated unease. Friends grew suspicious when calls went unanswered. Teachers noticed the children missing from class. And soon, the silence could no longer be ignored. Police were the first to enter. What they found inside froze them in place. Even seasoned officers, men and women who had seen countless crime scenes, described it as unforgettable. The rooms told a story of chaos, of violence, of control finally snapping into catastrophe. It was not just a scene, it was a message. Investigators began piecing together the timeline. Neighbors were questioned, phone records pulled. Every small detail mattered. How long had the family been trapped? When exactly had things escalated? And most importantly, where was he now? The suspect was not hiding. Not yet. In fact, when police tracked him down, he seemed calm. Too calm. He spoke with practiced words, spinning excuses, attempting to frame himself as misunderstood. But officers had already seen enough. The evidence inside that house painted a different picture, a picture that no explanation could erase. His arrest was swift, but the tension was far from over. Community members gathered, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster revealed in headlines. This was a father who attended church, a neighbor who mowed his lawn, a man who waved at passers-by. Now his name was spoken with disbelief and horror. As the case unfolded, chilling details surfaced. Journals, notes, fragments of plans that suggested this was not an impulsive act but something building for months, maybe. Detectives uncovered red flags no one had acted on. Reports of strange behavior, whispers of domestic tension, unexplained injuries. Each clue added to the haunting realization this could have been stopped. The courtroom was the final stage, packed with journalists, family members, and spectators. It became a theater of reckoning. Every testimony cut deeper. Survivors' voices trembled as they relived the fear. Experts laid out the evidence step by step. Photos, phone logs, witness accounts, they left little room for doubt. And then there was him. Sitting at the defense table, he appeared unmoved. No tears, no regret, no recognition of the devastation he had caused. Witnesses described his stare as cold, detached, as though he were watching someone else's trial. Even in the courtroom, his face showed no regret. Prosecutors painted him as a manipulator, a man who built a mask of normalcy, hiding behind it while tormenting the people who trusted him most. They spoke of control, of cruelty, of choices made again and again until tragedy was inevitable. The jury listened in silence, their faces hardening with each revelation. The defense tried to argue stress, anger, even momentary loss of control. But the evidence spoke louder. The journals. The patterns. The silence of a family too afraid to cry out for help. This was not a single mistake. This was years of terror culminating in one devastating act. When the verdict came, the courtroom was still. Guilty on every count. Some felt relief. Others felt rage that justice had come too late. Because no sentence, no verdict could bring back what had been lost. The children who would never laugh the same way again. The home that would forever feel like a graveyard. The trust in a father's love shattered beyond repair. As he was led away in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions. He never answered. He never looked back. His silence was louder than any words he could have spoken. The aftermath rippled far beyond the courtroom. Neighbors asked themselves how they had missed the signs. Teachers wondered if they should have pressed harder. Family members carried guilt like a weight, replaying conversations, wishing they had seen more, done more, spoken sooner. The case became more than just a headline. It became a warning. That evil does not always wear a mask of horror. Sometimes it wears the face of a father. And in the end, justice may have been served, but the scars left behind would never fully heal. When the trial ended and the gavel fell, the story might have seemed complete. Justice, at least on paper, was served. A guilty man behind bars. A community shaken but moving forward. Yet for those who lived through it, the survivors, the relatives, the neighbors, the story never truly ended. Because how do you recover when the person you trusted most becomes the person you fear most? How do you rebuild when home itself was the battlefield? That is the lingering shadow in cases like this. The crime does not stop when the suspect is arrested. It does not stop when the verdict is read. It lingers in memories and nightmares, in the quiet moments when survivors still hear footsteps in the hallway, still flinch at sudden noises, still wonder if love can ever feel safe again. This story reminds us of an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it lives under your own roof, sometimes it wears a smile, sometimes it tucks you in at night, and that is what makes it so terrifying. We expect monsters to look like monsters, but the most dangerous ones blend in. They attend school events, they wave to neighbors' eyes. They sit at dinner tables wearing masks so convincing that even those closest to them struggled to see the truth. By the time the mask slips, it's already too late. The father in this story is gone now, taken away by the justice system. But his actions left scars that will last far longer than his prison sentence. His children will carry those memories into adulthood. His community will carry the burden of silence, the regret of missed red flags. And we as observers are left with one haunting question. How many more stories like this are hidden behind closed doors? It forces us to ask ourselves, would we notice the signs if they were happening next door? Would we believe the quiet child who never speaks up in class? Would we question the neighbor who seems a little too strict, a little too controlling? Or would we, like so many in this story, tell ourselves it's not our business? The most chilling thought of all is that this case is not an isolated nightmare. It is one of many. Families everywhere hide their pain behind smiles, hoping someone will notice, praying someone will step in before it's too late. So maybe the true lesson here is not just about punishment. It is about awareness, about listening more closely, about daring to ask hard questions when something feels wrong, because sometimes saving a life means paying attention to the smallest of red flags. The story of the most evil fathers in history is not just about their crimes, it's about the silence that let those crimes grow. And that leaves me with a question for you. What do you think creates monsters like this? Are they born with darkness inside them, or does something in their lives twist them into what they become? I want to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below, because the conversation around these cases matters. If this story left you thinking, if it made you question the nature of love, fear, and trust, then make sure to like this video, share it with others who follow true crime stories, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next case we uncover. Because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones closest to home.